Good morning, boys and girls. We're going to continue our book, The Ghost of Lizard Light. Today we are on chapter 3, or chapter 2, excuse me. Oh no, it's chapter 3. Here we go. I even have it bookmarked. Oh my goodness. All right. I hope today finds you healthy and ready to listen on our Wednesday of remote learning. So here we go. Chapter 3. Now remember, in our first two chapters, Jack found out that his family is moving, and he's moving away from his best friend who lives right across the street from him, but he hasn't told him yet. So this is how our chapter opens. Jack climbed back into his bed and tried working on his math problems, but he had a hard time concentrating. All he could think about was the move. When he heard the sound of Happy Birthday drifting up the stairs again, Jack felt his stomach tighten. He put his head down on his desk. "What's wrong?" Denton appeared in Jack's doorway. "Haven't you finished your math yet?" "No, but that's not it." Jack paused and looked up at Denton. "My dad took a new job, and we're moving to Maine." "Maine? You mean like the state of Maine?" "That's exactly what I mean," Jack sighed. "But you can't!" Denton cried. "I mean, you've always lived here. We've always lived across the street from each other. What's going to happen to us when you move all the way to Maine?" "I don't know if there's any ifs about it," Jack said. "My parents have already talked to a realtor." Denton sat down on Jack's bed, and the two boys discussed emergency plans on how they could remain together. They talked about running away, but they didn't know where to go. They talked about Denton moving in with the Carltons, or Jack moving in with Denton and his father, but they knew their parents would never agree to it. Jack spent the following weeks dreaming up schemes that would keep him in Iowa. His favorite one had him sneaking into the McCormick's house and living there, hidden for the rest of his life in Denton's closet. Denton could sneak food and candy into him. He was the kind of friend who would do that. But then Jack remembered the stale-tasting mint candies in the glass bowl on Denton's dining room table, and he thought about the nasty tuna fish casseroles Mr. McCormick always made. Jack hated tuna fish casseroles. He wondered what it would be like living in Denton's closet, where there was always a huge pile of dirty clothes. He imagined living his life there, alone in the dark, smelling dirty socks and eating stale mints and tuna fish day after day. He decided to come up with a better plan. If he had more time, Jack might have been able to come up with the scheme that kept him in Iowa. But things were happening much too fast. Soon after the realtor put the for sale sign up in the Carltons' front yard, a couple made a down payment on their house. Things moved even faster after that. School was out for summer vacation, and the weeks seemed to fly by. And then the dreaded day arrived. They were moving. It was really happening. All along, Jack had been praying that by some big mistake or bad dream he would wake up from it. Even in the final moment, as he and Denton stood out on the driveway, saying their last goodbyes, Jack hoped for a miracle that would let him stay. Denton had brought along a grocery bag full of presents for everyone. He reached in and pulled out a gift wrap box of sparkly band-aids for Franny to use on her patients, and then he pulled out a head of lettuce wrapped in Christmas paper for Ned, and after these had been handed out, he turned to Jack. "And I wanted to give you something special to remember me by," Denton said softly. He reached into the bag and pulled out his harmonica. He pressed it into Jack's hand. "I won't play anything but Happy Birthday on it," he promised. "I don't think it will let you play anything else," Denton joked. Jack gave Denton a small bag of rocks from his collection, including an amethyst that Denton had wanted. The two promised to write an email when Denton got a computer. Then, feeling embarrassed by the tears in his eyes, Jack hurried to his car. As his dad pulled out of the driveway, Jack leaned out the window and said, "Hey, Dent, do you know that your t-shirt is on inside out?" He watched as Denton bent his unruly mop of red hair over his shirt, and then he lifted his head. He was wearing a sheepish grin. "We're off on our adventure to Maine," Mr. Carleton said cheerfully. "Off to the far end of nowhere," Jack whispered under his breath. There would be no miracles to let him stay. He was on his way to Maine. All right, boys and girls. I don't know if you know where the state of Maine is, but that might be something you might want to look up on a map. Google United States maps and look to see where Maine is. It is in the far eastern corner of the United States. It's known for its lobsters and lighthouses. Chapter 4. Ned seemed as upset about the move as Jack. He paced back and forth in his terrarium on the floor of the back seat. He seemed anxious and jittery. Jack thought he understood. Ned didn't want to move to Maine any more than he did. "You know, we have a big surprise for you kids," Mrs. Carleton said from the front seat as they crossed the Iowa state line. "Can we have it now?" Franny asked. She was dressed in a silvery alien costume that she had insisted on wearing for the trip. "No, you'll have to wait, but you'll find out at our new house," their mother explained. "I thought Dad said it was an old house," Jack interrupted. Mr. Carleton behind the steering wheel nodded. "Yes, that's right. It is an old house, but it's going to be new and unusual experience living there. I can promise you that. And the house sits beside this very big surprise," Mrs. Carleton said. "Chuck E. Cheese?" Franny cried. "Will Chuck E. Cheese be our neighbor? Is that the big surprise?" "Will you get over Chuck E. Cheese's?" Jack groaned. "No, honey," Mrs. Carleton said. "I've already told you. They don't have a Chuck E. Cheese where we're going." "Why?" Franny asked. "Why don't they have a Chuck E. Cheese?" The long drive to Maine was off to a bad start. Franny kept trying to feed Ned, dropping bits of her peanut butter and jelly sandwich into his terrarium. Ned, being the well-mannered lizard that he was, never complained as chunks of bread and blobs of jelly landed on his head. Jack complained, though, and loudly. "Stop throwing food on Ned. He's not a garbage can, he's a lizard." "But he likes peanut butter and jelly," Franny explained. "Does not. Does too. Does not. Mom!" The trip out to Maine took forever. Jack tried several times to play the harmonica, but he choked up at the thought of never seeing Denton again and quickly put it away. They had stopped to sleep in a motel in Pennsylvania, and the next day they drove out of one rainstorm in New York into another in Vermont. Jack felt as if they would never get there. Franny spent most of her time decorating her stuffed animals. Two teddy bears died of a mysterious disease in New York State, and a stuffed bunny succumbed in Connecticut. Jack offered to help dispose of the bodies by throwing them out the window, but Franny rejected his offer with a loud "don't." Mrs. Carleton suggested they all sing. They sang along to a few songs on the radio, and then they stopped. Franny continued to hum. She hummed as they crossed the Maine border, and was still humming when they reached the sleepy little village of Minty. The constant clicking of the windshield wipers finally ceased as the car slowed down. "Close your eyes," Mr. Carleton commanded as they neared their new address. Both Jack and Franny, worn out from arguing for the last 200 miles of the drive, readily did as they were told. Franny put her hands over her eyes. Jack took a deep breath, hoping that somehow this big surprise would make him feel better. "Now," Franny squeaked as she peeked over her fingers. "Now," Mrs. Carlson called back as the car pulled into a gravel drive. Jack opened his eyes and looked through the lingering fog at the white shingled cottage before them. Then his eyes traveled from the front door down a long wooden walkway. The walkway led to a tall white tower that seemed to rise out of the flat gray rocks it sat on. From the top of the tower a beam of light shone. Beyond that, as far as he could see, was nothing but ocean. "It's a lighthouse!" Jack exclaimed, getting out of the car. "It's almost like my lamp." "It's called Lizard Light," Mr. Carleton said, coming up beside him. "From the sea, that piece of land with the lighthouse on it looks like a lizard's tail. That's why they call our lighthouse Lizard Light." Our lighthouse? Jack croaked. Well, not officially ours, Mr. Carlton admitted. It really belongs to the state. The Coast Guard maintains the light, and it's locked, so we can't get inside. But we'll be living in the keeper's house, and the tower does go with the house. It's so exciting, Mrs. Carlton beamed. She reached down and pulled Jack and Franny to her in a hug. Did you kids ever imagine that we'd be living beside a lighthouse? Actually, Jack had imagined that once after reading a book about a lighthouse keeper's daughter, but that had just been another one of his many made up stories, like living in a jungle or another planet. It was fun to imagine, but not something that really happened, that was really supposed to happen. If only the lighthouse could have been back home in Iowa instead of Minty, Maine, Jack thought. Then he would have enjoyed it. He and Denton would have enjoyed it together. But here, clear across the country, 1,500 miles away from his best friend, what good is it? The light rain was falling, so they all headed inside, Jack with the terrarium in his arms. The house was old, more than 100 years, according to the realtor. At the entrance, spelled out in flat pebbles over the arched doorway, were the words, Never Sink Cottage. Jack had never lived in a house that had its own name. Must have been the keeper's credo, suggested Mr. Carlton. Once inside, Jack immediately knew how different this house was from their home in Iowa. Their house in Ames had been brand new, and so was everything around it. But this old house seemed to be all about somebody else. Never Sink Cottage had a whispery feel to its low beam ceilings, and the bubbly glass in the windows held the memories of fingers pressed against it long ago. The wide window seat were worn smooth from someone else's waiting and watching. Jack was not the only one to notice the difference. Mr. and Mrs. Carleton lowered their voices to hushed whispers as they walked from room to room. Even Franny had stopped her humming. The views from the windows on either side of the living room fireplace were of the ocean. The constant sound of breaking waves echoed off the white plaster walls. There was a strong, salty, seaweedy smell coming through the screen door. Jars filled with sea glass and shells covered the mantel. A seagull had perched on the chimney. It was as close as a house could be to the edge of the ocean. All right, now boys and girls, do you know how sea glass is made? Another good thing to look up. So that's our chapters um, 3 and 4, and that's where we'll stop for today. Thank you. Hope you enjoy our book.